gonna teach you how to play the Lonely Boy, first tab and the second. So all you have to do is instead of playing the E open string, so instead of doing that, so you can do like a third fourth string um of the fourth string of the second fret. So pick down, low, E, 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 G, okay, E, 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 G. So that's slowly, E, 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 G, E, G, E, 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 D, E, 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 G, E, 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 D, E, 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 G, E, 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 D. E, 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 G, E, 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 D. So this is the first part. So I'll slow it down one more time. E, 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 G, E, 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 D, E, 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 and then G, open string of the third string, and then E, 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 D. So you can pause and then do it one more time. And the next one is so E, E, that'll be on the 5th fret of the second string. 5th, 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 3rd, and then, that's the second string, okay? 5th, 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 3rd, then 3rd string, 2nd, open, 2nd, 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 open, E, D, E, okay? I'll slow it down one more time. So I'll say the note. E, E, sorry, yeah, correct. E, 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 D. One more time. E, 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 D, A, G, A, E, E, D, E, E, D, A, G, A, A, G, B, E, E, D, E, E, D, E, 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 D, A, G, A, G, E, G, E. One more time. This is the one you can do it one more time. E, E, do it nice and slow. E, D, A, G, A, G, E, D, E. Make sense? So you can play that one. So the pick is just down. Hammer. Okay, can you see my hands? And then you can play the riff one more time from the top.